Perhaps one of the most theologically profound statements I've heard outside of the Bible actually came from a book called The Purpose-Driven Life. It's the very first sentence of the book, and it reads, "It's not about you." It's not about you. We start off thinking in life that everything is about us. Now, if you don't believe that, I want you to try and talk property rights with a 2-year-old. Okay? I mean, we think everything's about us. But as we grow up, we develop in maturity, we begin to understand more and more that life is not just about us. That's the reality. The universe does not revolve around us. And that should be all the more true for Christians who have become a part of God's plan. We have the privilege of participating in God's plan, His good plans. And He has good plans for us. But those plans are not about us. They're about Christ. God's plan ultimately all brings everything to Jesus. And God had good plans, as we've seen in the Bible. God had good plans to bless Abraham. You know, if you study the life of Abraham, God had good plans for him, and He did great things in the life of Abraham. But His plan was to work through Abraham to bless all the nations by sending the Messiah. That's what we're celebrating at Christmas, right? We're celebrating the birth of Jesus. But see, we should celebrate that every day. Jesus came. That's worth celebrating. And God had a plan to bless Jacob. We've seen him here in the Bible. And God had good plans for Jacob, even though Jacob did have some struggles in life. But God's plan and His promise to him was to make his descendants into a nation from which Jesus would come. And God had plans for Joseph's life, and Joseph went through hard times. I mean, we've seen that as we've been studying the life of Joseph. He went through some hard times, some difficult moments. But we've also seen that God had a plan to bless him and to bless his family through him so that they'd be in the right place at the right time for God's bigger plan, which was to take God's people down to Egypt and make them into a nation that God would later redeem. And so I'm going to suggest to you this morning that God always works this way. See, God has a plan for you. If you're here, if God created you, if you are in existence and He has given you life, God has a plan for you, and God has a good plan for you. He has good plans. But ultimately, the plan isn't just about you. It isn't really about you. It's about Jesus. God is blessing you and will bless you in a way that you can be a part of His bigger plan, which is to save the world. And as long as we see our lives as being about us, as long as we wallow in immaturity, we'll miss the point of life. We'll be disappointed. But when we begin to experience some spiritual maturity, we see that it's not about us, and it opens up a new world of possibilities and opportunities. And so today we're going to return to the story of Joseph. It is the Joseph with the colorful coat, not the one in the Christmas story. Just since we're in that season, I figured I'll mention that as we're passing by this way. We're in the Joseph in Genesis. But as we turn to the story of Joseph, I believe we see both in his life and in the life of his father Jacob that they seem to understand that there was a point when God's plan was just beyond them. It wasn't just about them, but it was about what God was doing through them. And so we left off with their family reunion last week after Joseph and his family had made it down to Egypt. And so we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 46, verse 31. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's family, "I will go up and inform Pharaoh, telling him, my brothers and my father's family, who were in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds. They also raise livestock. They have brought their flocks and herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh addresses you and asks, 'What is your occupation?' you are to say, 'Your servants, both we and our ancestors, have raised livestock from our youth until now.' Then you will be allowed to settle in the land of Goshen, since all shepherds are detestable to Egyptians." So we pick up here with Joseph. His family's come down and he's preparing them and preparing for the political side of his family's relocation. Okay, they have made it there. Technically, they would probably be considered refugees. For us, this is a little bit hard to get our minds wrapped around because we live in a free society. We don't usually have to care what our rulers think of us. So long as we obey the laws, we're okay. I mean, you don't break the law, you'll do fine. When's the last time you really cared what the rulers thought of you? Or even if they did think of you, other than the IRS, I don't think they know we exist, right? We're just here. And truth is, in a free society, we can dislike our rulers. We can speak against those in power in our nation. But when you live under a king who's all-powerful, it doesn't work that way. Okay? They did not have the freedoms that we enjoy. You always have to be sure in that situation that you're in the king's good graces. And so Joseph is working the political angle here. He's going to ensure that Pharaoh is pleased. Pharaoh has been pleased with Joseph. Pharaoh told Joseph, go get your family, bring them back. But he wants to keep this on a good, positive note. And he's going to present some of his family to Pharaoh to try and make a good impression. I think Joseph's hope is that Pharaoh will allow his family to settle in the land of Goshen, which is the northeastern part of the Nile Delta. If you were in northeastern Egypt, it's a good place for cattle. It's well watered. The Nile was the main river flowing through Egypt, and it would overflow every year, and that would cause the land to be watered, but also to be fertilized. And so it was a good place for farming and livestock and so forth. In fact, probably one of the best areas for farming and livestock in the ancient world was there in the Nile Delta. Goshen was that part of Egypt closest to the promised land there on the Nile Delta. And so in a way, Joseph is kind of manipulating or pushing to keep the children of Israel nearer to the land that God promised them. And from the Egyptians' point of view, it also puts them off near the border. If they don't like shepherds in their neighborhood, we'll put them over there. Kind of like, we're going to put you all down south next to the border. Okay, that would be kind of their dynamic. And so Joseph instructs his family to tell Pharaoh that they are keepers of livestock because shepherds are detestable to Egyptians. And apparently that will help them get to settle in Goshen, which is a land suitable for livestock and shepherding. It'll also keep them away from Pharaoh's court. It's a dynamic you see in Joseph's life. Joseph is always off with Pharaoh. He's overdoing the work of Egypt and the cities, and his family's over in Goshen. They're off in the farmland. The Egyptians were city dwellers, and they saw that as good. They didn't like country life. The rednecks out there, we ain't going to be, associating with them. There was that kind of a dynamic. And so Joseph seems to take steps that will help his family keep them separate from the Egyptians so they can grow into the nation God had promised. This is a blessing that they'll be separate. We shouldn't overlook the fact that shepherds are what God had made his people to be. There's a lot of imagery in the Bible that God will use throughout Scripture with shepherds. In fact, Jesus is the good shepherd. He compares himself to a shepherd. The Egyptians may detest shepherds, but God does not. See, the Egyptians despised that. And I think there's a dynamic of this throughout history, stretching across many cultures. In our sinfulness, we tend to despise that which is common. We despise that which is common. In our culture, there are those who tend to look down on any profession that wears overalls. Right? That's a blue-collar worker. We look down on people who wear jeans, but we look up to people who wear suits. But the truth is, our nation was built by people in denim and usually ravished by people in suits. I don't know how we got this dynamic because the people in overalls are the ones who build everything, and the people in suits are usually your mafia members and your politicians. I don't know why, we have this dynamic. Right now, we have been seeing, some supply shortage problems here in our own country. And let me ask you, would you rather more farmers and truck drivers, or would you rather have more lawyers and politicians? Which was more helpful to us? Okay, just think about that. But if someone walks into church wearing overalls and someone else walks in wearing a suit, and I'm not necessarily talking about our church because we're pretty friendly and open to everybody, but in other churches, which would be reacted better to? Why? See, we should remember without farmers and truck drivers, we wouldn't have anything to eat. And without politicians, we wouldn't have anything to complain about. Okay? Now, there is a spiritual lesson in this, and I think God does not treat, we should get this understanding, God does not treat the common with contempt. He created it. But often, God has disdain for man-made pride and pretenses. God uses the common, the shepherd, the farmer, the fisherman, the merchant, to illustrate the kingdom of God, to illustrate His grace. Look at the teachings of Jesus. He was always calling upon these illustrations to show God's kingdom, to show God's grace. So I think we should be like Him and value the humble things in life. It's okay to be humble. Actually, it's good to be humble. We should also be aware that who God made you to be, the person God made you to be, may not be popular in the world. God's the one who called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He called them out of the world. Remember, Abraham was down in the city of Ur? He called them out of the world and into the land that He would show them. He's the one who made them Bedouin shepherds who wandered around for 3 generations. And He blessed them. He blessed them with flocks, and He blessed them with herds. And now they're down in Egypt, and the Egyptians despise people who are shepherds. But see, shepherds are necessary for food. Okay, if nobody raises cows, how are you going to get a hamburger? Or a steak? And by the way, Egyptians like to eat beef, so you need someone to raise the cow. They despised what was common. And who the Israelites were, what they were, is what God had called them to be. And the Egyptians despised them for it. The world will often do this. But as followers of Christ, we should not. We should not follow the world's example by despising the humble. So we see Joseph here. He's preparing his family, and then he's going to present them, some of them, to Pharaoh. And we'll go ahead and pick up in chapter 47, verse 1. So Joseph went and informed Pharaoh, my father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all that they own, have come from the land of Canaan and are now in the land of Goshen. He took 5 of his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asked his brothers, what is your occupation? They said to Pharaoh, your servants, both we and our ancestors, are shepherds. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to stay in the land for a while because there is no grazing land for your servants' sheep, since the famine in the land of Canaan has been severe. So now please let your servants settle in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, now that your father and brothers have come to you, the land of Egypt is open before you. Settle your father and brothers in the best of the land. They can live in the land of Goshen. If you know any capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. So you'll notice that while the Egyptians despised shepherds, they still needed them to take care of their livestock. We'll put them to work. We don't like them. We don't want them near, in our neighborhood, but we'll put them to work. Joseph presents 5 of his brothers to Pharaoh. We're not told which brothers he presented, but to me it would be reasonable to assume he presented whichever ones Joseph thought would make the best presentation. He's trying to influence Pharaoh, and so he picks out the 5 he thought would do best. Joseph seems to really understand how the politics of Egypt worked. Okay, he's a wise man. He's shrewd. He understands how to work things, how to get things done. He knew how to work the system for maximum effect. And that's not wrong. It's not wrong to be wise. It's not wrong to work within the system that God places you. everything Joseph does here is honest. Okay, he doesn't instruct his family to lie. He instructs them to tell them the truth. He explains to them, this is what you need to say to Pharaoh. But what he's saying is true. He knows how to work the system in an honest way. And so within that honesty, I don't think it's wrong to work within the system, whatever system it is that we find ourselves. Being a rebel against the system, I'll tell you, is rarely effective and usually ungodly. God does not speak highly of rebels. And so what we see in Joseph is someone who, he's being honest, but he's working within the system. Pharaoh responds very favorably to Joseph's presentation. He tells Joseph, that to settle his family in the best of the land. And you want them to live in Goshen? Go right ahead. They can go out there in that cattle range. They can live out there. And he also tells Joseph that if any of his brothers happen to be particularly skilled, okay, he's not just assuming, they'll be good at it, but if they're particularly skilled, then you can put them in charge of my cattle. Pharaoh's done well with Joseph being in charge of things. And so he wouldn't mind to do even better. We're not told if Joseph does this. In fact, my guess is Joseph doesn't necessarily have a real high opinion of his brother's skills. Remember, he was always reporting back to Dad how they were being lazy. They were not told that he ever picks any of them to be in charge of Pharaoh's cattle. In fact, my suspicion is he keeps his family separate. There seems to be that dynamic. They're having this food supplied, there's some food supplied in the famine. Joseph's family, all of Jacob's family have come down and they're living there with Joseph. Their food's being supplied. But understand that doesn't mean that they're getting a free ride. They will be provided for by Pharaoh, but they also are now Pharaoh's servants. Pharaoh is saying, hey, if any of them are skilled, put them in charge of this. We're going to put them to work. This may be a little bit of a hard concept for us to think about because in our society we tend to give out, welfare with no strings attached, so there may be some paperwork. Think back to the Great Depression. If you think back to the Great Depression, our nation actually enlisted people around the country to do work projects. Now, I know none of you are quite old enough in your own right to remember this, but if you watch some old movies or if you've had any older relatives, they might be able to tell you about it. They did work projects. In fact, they built a lot of roads, they built dams, they did, projects within the city. And so people who needed government support because they were in a depression, who needed food, who needed shelter, would work for the government, and the government would provide them with housing, although sometimes it was tents. The government would provide them with food, would even provide them with some pay, but they had to work for it. Does that make sense? That's the way it worked back in the Great Depression. This was before we had some of the things we have now. Actually, it would be before they invented Social Security. So if you go back to that. That's probably more the dynamic of Pharaoh's provision for Joseph's family. They're having everything provided for them through Joseph, but Joseph has to keep working. And if any of them are skilled, they're going to work. And at the very least, they're going to be expected to be good citizens and supportive of the kingdom. They're now Pharaoh's servants. And they may be enlisted to serve Pharaoh when needed. Jacob is also presented to Pharaoh, which seems, I think, to have had a good encounter. Let's pick up in verse 7 of Genesis chapter 47. It says, Joseph then brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many years have you lived? Jacob said to Pharaoh, my pilgrimage has lasted 130 years. My years have been few and hard, and they have not reached the years of my ancestors during their pilgrimages. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and departed from Pharaoh's presence. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers in the land of Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided for his father and his brothers and all his father's family with food for their dependents. And so we have here Jacob appearing before Pharaoh. He's 130 years old when he goes down to Egypt. I don't know if you're ready for that journey when you're 130. You'll be there. I find it interesting, his description to Pharaoh is he says, I'm 130 years old and my years have been few and hard. Anybody here think 130 young and, just, few years? Now, in fairness to Jacob, let's be fair to Jacob here for a moment. He had a fairly hard life. I mean, as we go through the story of Jacob, you see he did have a pretty hard life. And it's hard for us to consider 130 years to be few, but lifespans at his point in life were in the process of shrinking to what we now know them. Noah, from the great flood, who lived to be 950 years old, would have still been alive at the time of Abraham, Jacob's grandfather. So when Abraham was born, Noah was still alive. Whether or not they met, we're not told. We don't know if Noah and Abraham met. Maybe they met, maybe they didn't. But their lives did overlap here on earth. Abraham lived to be 175 years old. That's Jacob's grandfather. Isaac lived to be 180 years old. That's Jacob's father. So to Jacob, being 130, it probably seemed like a short life. Okay, from his perspective. Now to us, that seems, can you imagine what Social Security would be like if you could live to be, 100, you want to talk about the government going bankrupt, but right there. But, by the way, Jacob would in the end live only a merely 147 years before he dies. Okay, lifespans are getting shorter. During this part of the Bible. But to Pharaoh, I'm going to guess to Pharaoh, Jacob seemed kind of old. Why do I think that? Because he asked, how many years have you lived? Just something about the question, the way he said, makes me think he's looking at Jacob and saying, man, this guy's old. That's my impression. And I think Pharaoh was probably impressed with Jacob. Most cultures throughout history have stronger reverence for those who have become elderly, who have lived long and survived the trials of life. In our society, we're actually the oddity. Our society tends to worship youth and beauty. Not to say other societies don't like beauty, but most societies have a greater reverence for the aged rather than the young. In fact, I recall a story. We had a member of our church who was Native American, and he chose to go to our senior Bible study because he wanted to learn from the elders. That's kind of a difference in culture, but, and I think our senior Bible study said, finally, someone. There's a difference in culture. Ours is the oddity, but Pharaoh would have respected that Jacob was 130 years old. And so the meeting seems to have gone very well. Jacob blesses Pharaoh. We aren't told what he says to Pharaoh other than that he blessed him. But likely he's giving some form of verbal blessing. He's grateful to Pharaoh. Pharaoh's allowing his family to come and to live there and to have land and to raise their cattle. And so Jacob is grateful in the famine and grateful for the blessing to his family. So he blesses Pharaoh. And then Joseph settles them in the best of the land provided for their needs. The land of Ramesses, by the way, is also the land of Goshen. Ramesses is a pharaoh that comes along later, and that area gets his name. Well, Joseph did take care of his family, which is a good example to us all, by the way. He also continues to be faithful to his job for Pharaoh. So he's still in charge of the food distribution. He's still the man of the hour. In fact, it was common they had what they called a vizier in Egypt, who would be like second to Pharaoh, who would oversee many of these things. And so that would have been Joseph's job. And he continues to faithfully do that job, even though his family has come. Sometimes maybe in life we allow family dynamics to consume us so that we're not good for anything else. I don't know that that's a good biblical model. I think what we see here, and maybe it's even an overemphasis on our part on family. Well, my family's got a problem. I can't work this week. Well, you're going to pay rent this week? The reality of life is sometimes you got to keep your job anyway. And maybe we think of ourselves far too important in too many things. But what we see in Joseph is that he continues faithfully to do the work he's been given regardless of circumstance. And we need to learn to do that, I think, the way Joseph did. We have to learn that God's plan goes beyond just us. It goes beyond my circumstances at this moment. It goes beyond the difficulties I'm facing. It may go beyond the family crisis. You know what? I don't know about your family. Sometimes my family has crisis. Any of your families ever have a crisis? Okay. You know what? Those crises come and go, and there'll be a new one next week. God's kingdom is eternal. We've got to stay focused. Don't be distracted. Now, what happens here, though, is Joseph does continue in that job, and let's pick up in verse 13 of chapter 47. But there was no food in the entire region, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan were exhausted by the famine. Joseph collected all the silver to be found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they were purchasing. And he brought the silver to Pharaoh's palace. When the silver from the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was gone, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die in front of you? The silver is gone." But Joseph said, "Give me your livestock. Since the silver is gone, I will give you food in exchange for your livestock." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for the horses and flocks of sheep and herds of cattle and donkeys. That year he provided them with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was over, they came the next year and said to him, "We cannot hide from our Lord that the silver is gone, and all our livestock belongs to our Lord. There is nothing left for our Lord except our bodies and our land. Why should we die here in front of you, both us and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. Then we with our land will become Pharaoh's slaves. Give us seed so that we can live and not die, and so that the land won't become desolate." In this way, Joseph acquired all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh, because every Egyptian sold his field since the famine was so severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's. And Joseph made the people servants from one end of Egypt to the other. The only land he did not acquire belonged to the priests, for they had an allowance from Pharaoh. They ate from the allowance that Pharaoh gave them, therefore they did not sell their land. Joseph said to the people, "Understand today that I have acquired you and your land for Pharaoh. Here is seed for you, sow it in the land. At harvest you are to give a fifth of it to Pharaoh, and 4/5 will be yours as seed for the field and as for food for yourselves and your households and your dependents." "You have saved our lives," they said. "We have found favor with our Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves." So Joseph made it a law, still in effect today in the land of Egypt, that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. Only the priest's land does not belong to Pharaoh. So basically what we see here is Joseph enslaves the entire nation of Egypt. All of the Egyptian people, making it so that almost all of the land and all of the people are directly owned by Pharaoh himself. Prior to this, they seem to have had private property ownership. But after this, Egypt moves to a different system similar to what we might think of as feudalism. If you think back in the Middle Ages in Europe, when the kings owned everything and you just lived on the land and you were a tenant of the king's land. And pretty much, if you were there, you had to do what the king said and pay your taxes, pay your rents, pay whatever the king said was required. And that's kind of where this goes. We should remember that Joseph's plan was, during the years of the plenty, when all the 7 years of good were there, 1/5 or 20% of all the grain during the 7 years of plenty would be taken by Pharaoh. It was a tax. Okay, we're going to have 7 good years, so we're going to tax 20% of everything that there is, and we're going to store it up for the years of famine. Now, the famine, now when it was good, everybody was happy with that. We've got all this money coming in, we've got all this grain coming in, we'll gladly give Pharaoh 20%. No problem. Now that the famine is there, Joseph is selling the grain that he collected as a tax. In so doing, it says he collects all the silver in Egypt and in Canaan. All of those nations, throughout that little Middle Eastern area right there, he collects all the silver they have, and he puts it all in Pharaoh's palace. Man, Pharaoh's getting wealthy because of Joseph. When they run out of money, Joseph then starts bartering with them. They're saying, hey, you've got all our money. We've given you everything. And Joseph says to them, well, you know what? Hey, you still got some cows over there and some sheep over here. Why don't we trade that? So he barters with them. You bring your livestock, and we will give you food. We'll trade. So then all the livestock in Egypt belongs to Pharaoh. When they run out of livestock, they come to him and say, why should we starve? Why should the land perish? There'll be no one left. Save us. And Joseph trades food for land, food for their very lives, so that the land of Egypt and all of the people in it become the property of Pharaoh. And how do they respond? They say, oh, thank you for saving us. I just find this an interesting political dynamic. Do you ever thank the government for giving you your own money? Just think about that dynamic. That is what they're doing. They're thanking Pharaoh for giving them their own food that they grew, and now he's using it to buy them as slaves. Now, this didn't apply to the priests, which there were a lot of priests in Egypt and their temples, because they had a food allowance. They were actually funded by the government. Pharaoh, gave a food allowance to all the priests, so they didn't have to sell their land. They could keep running on what their allowance was. And it made a situation where all of the land in Egypt was either owned by the temples or by the state. There is no private ownership of anything else. In society, in Egyptian society, in the ancient world, farmers were actually considered about the same level as slaves. They dig in the dirt. Egyptians were city people. They like to live in the city. You send the slaves out to do that work. And technically they were slaves after this because they were owned by Pharaoh. They worked all the land and they sent a fifth of everything, 20% to Pharaoh from then on. And 80% of what they got they could keep, and they could use it to plant next year's crops and to live on. Now in America, if you go back in our history, you might compare this to sharecropping. Okay, I know medieval history, probably none of you quite lived through medieval history, so, that's a little more ancient. Sharecropping, the farmer would own the land, but they would have people live on it and work it. The farmer would get his percentage, and they'd get the rest of it. Sharecropping. That's probably about the way life in Egypt would have been under Pharaoh, is you never actually owned the farm, you just worked the farm and gave Pharaoh his share. It's also the way it would have worked at the serfs in medieval Europe. You worked the land, and the king or the lord over you would get his share of whatever you grew. For Egypt, I suspect this goes all the way back to Joseph. He changed the dynamic of their country to bring them all into slavery under Pharaoh. And much like the Dark Ages, most Egyptians didn't have a chance to change their status because they were born into their class. Now, for us, this is also a very hard thing to get into our minds, but if you think maybe more like India, where you're born into a caste, Egypt would work that way. Whatever your parents were, that would determine your educational and professional future. If your parents were slaves, you were a slave. If your parents were farmers, you were a farmer. Now, if you had a parent that was skilled as at some form of trade, then you might get a chance to learn that trade. The priest had children, they likely grew up to be priests, and the scribes had children, they went to school to be scribes. They were probably the only ones who knew how to read anyway. And the nobility were all blood related to Pharaoh, who was, they thought, descended from the gods. So wherever you were born, you were just stuck there. I don't know about you, to me that sounds kind of miserable. But that's the way their life would have been. There was one way out, and that was to become a soldier. Actually, this is pretty much the same in the Middle Ages. If you didn't like your lot in life, you could join the army. In fact, most second-born children in Egypt would join the army because the firstborn got the inheritance. I mean, you may not actually own the house, but who gets the farmstead when mom and dad goes? The oldest. So if you're second-born, you get nothing, okay? Because you don't even get to inherit the farmstead. So you join the army. Now, if you join the army, you could make money because if anybody you kill, you get to loot the bodies. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's that. And Egypt actually would treat their soldiers pretty well if you survived. I mean, they treat you pretty well and give you a place to live and land. So that was their way out. Nonetheless, Joseph's actions, what we see here in this passage, Joseph's actions make Pharaoh rich and powerful. Not that he wasn't already rich and powerful. I mean, he was Pharaoh. But in my opinion, what we see is a historical shift of God using Joseph to shape Egypt. They take what is a powerful nation and they become the world's first superpower. In their region, there is nothing to oppose Pharaoh. He has all the food, all the wealth, all the livestock, probably the only standing army. He's Pharaoh, and he sees himself as a god, which might explain why we get to the time of Moses and Pharaoh's a little bit arrogant. Okay? He sees himself that way. Egypt remained a world influence until the rise of the world-dominating empires like Babylon. Okay? Until Nebuchadnezzar comes along, Egypt stays around. Nebuchadnezzar kind of puts an end to him, and then the Persians come and so forth. Now, this is where I suspect we see God using Joseph's life to enact a plan that goes far beyond just him. God put Joseph in this place, and God had certainly blessed Joseph for his faithfulness. We've seen that. No matter what Joseph went through, he stayed faithful to God, and God blessed him even in the worst circumstances. God took him from being a slave, from being a prisoner, to being the second most powerful man in the world. And as a part of his plan, God used Joseph to save his family from famine. See, God knew the famine was coming. God already knew everything that was going to happen, and he used Joseph to save Jacob, to save his brothers, to save all of their descendants, the descendants of Abraham, so that they would survive, even when the rest of the Middle Eastern world was being destroyed. God's plan, though, went beyond just Joseph. It went beyond just his family, and it extended to save many lives. See, Joseph saved the lives through this food, saved the lives of Canaanites. Everybody was coming and buying food from Joseph. All those people were saved. In fact, that's one of the things I find so amazing about the Egyptian people. They are thanking Joseph for saving their life, even though he's getting everything for Pharaoh. But he is saving their life. Because if it had not been for Pharaoh's dream and Joseph interpreting it and Joseph's plan, they would have all died. So God works through them in a much bigger picture. But see, I find the same for us. We get tied up in what's going on in our life. I mean, where I'm at right now. The difficulties I'm facing today. The difficulties my family's having at Thanksgiving. By the way, you want to save money on Christmas? Well, it's too late now, but if you wanted to save money on Christmas presents, just talk politics at Thanksgiving. You won't have to buy anything. So, okay. We get caught up in that, but see, God works in our lives, and he will work in your life. He'll work in your situation. He'll work through the difficulties you face. He will bless you, but he'll do so in a way that promotes his plan in the world around you. Now, in Joseph's case, God went far beyond saving just the ancient world, beyond saving just his family. See, God had a plan for Joseph that went beyond the point of his life. He was taking their family down so that they could become the nation of Israel. He promised Abraham over 400 years they're going to be in this foreign nation. God's doing all of that through Joseph. So he can make them a powerful nation. And God is using Joseph to make Egypt a powerful nation. Why? Because what's going to happen here very shortly, 400 years shortly to God, is God's going to show his power to bring Israel out of Egypt. See, God doesn't go into some third world nation and say, hey, you let my people go. No, God goes into the most powerful nation on earth in their time, to Pharaoh who thinks he's a god, to Pharaoh who owns everything, and says, you let my people go. And when Pharaoh says, who are you? God says, I'm going to show you. And he does. See, God is using Joseph to set the stage for God's glory and power to be shown. Yes, he makes Egypt wealthy, but that's because he's going to use that wealthy, powerful Egypt to show how really powerful God is in compared to Egypt's little teeny tiny power. And even more so, God is setting the stage. He's using Joseph. He's creating the nation of Israel. He's going to lead them out of Egypt. But he's doing all of this so that Israel will be there for eventually the Messiah, because Jesus is coming to save us all. Each step leads to the next. And I think this is worth us paying attention to because it's how God works. You may think you're just an insignificant shepherd. You may think you're a slave to forces outside of your control. You know, there were days where Joseph was. You may think you're a prisoner in an unjust world, because sometimes life will not be fair. But there is a God in heaven who sits firmly on his throne, and he has full power to use your life as a part of his eternal plan. Never think God's power is limited by your ability or by your circumstance. Because if anybody should show us that that's not so, it's the life of Joseph. We should trust God, and we should accept his plan for our life, and we should accept that it goes beyond just us. God's plan for you extends beyond where you're at today. It extends beyond our lifetime. And I believe this is a dynamic we see in Jacob as we close out this chapter. See, Jacob's preparing for the end of his life. He was 130, but he does have a few more years. Look at verse 27 of Genesis 47. It says, Israel, that's Jacob, Israel settled in the land of Egypt in the region of Goshen, and they acquired property in it and became fruitful and very numerous. Now Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, and his lifespan was 147 years. When the time approached for him to die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if I have found favor with you, put your hand under my thigh and promise me that you will deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt. When I rest with my ancestors, carry me away from Egypt and bury me in their burial place. Joseph answered, I will do as you have asked. Jacob said, swear to me. So Joseph swore to him, and then Israel bowed in thanks at the head of his bed. Now, life in Egypt was actually good for Joseph's family. I mean, they're doing good. I mean, the rest of the world may be going south, but they're doing good. They've got good land for grazing their cattle. They're multiplying. They're prospering. And over the next 400 years, they'll grow into a great nation, just as God had promised. And Jacob is nearing the end of his life, and he seems focused on what is to come. And that's, I think, a normal reaction to an emotionally healthy person. I've seen people living in denial, people who can't deal with the reality that death is approaching, either for themselves or for loved ones. They just think it'll never happen to them. But most of us, I think, have come to the realization that the death rate is 100%. Okay? Maybe different reasons, maybe different times. Some of us have, maybe 147 years, I don't know. But it's still 100%. We all got to go sometime. And the closer we get to that time of our own departure, I think the more we see life is not just about us. We start to think of our legacy. We start to think about what God's done in our life and what we hope he'll do after we're gone. And so Jacob calls Joseph away from his work, away from Pharaoh. Come on down to Goshen. We want to talk to you. To promise that when he dies, when Jacob dies, he'll be buried. Joseph will bury him where his ancestors are buried. Jacob wants to be buried in the family plot. Y'all can relate? I mean, they got a family plot, and that's where Jacob wants to go. Abraham and Sarah are buried there. Isaac and Rebekah are buried there. Jacob's wife Leah is buried there. And so Jacob says, when I die, that's where I want you to promise to bury me. Now, I don't know that this is terribly odd, but it's not convenient, particularly in the ancient world. Today, I mean, you can have a plot across country and get your body flown and wherever, and I think most people today are opting for cremations more and more because of convenience and expense. But in the ancient world, usually, and in most cultures around the world, once you die, they bury you kind of quick. Okay, dead bodies laying around too long start to smell. Okay, so once you die, they bury you quick. That's usually the custom most of the world over. The Egyptians did have mummification, so they knew how to deal with the body and make it last, and they do that to Jacob, so they're able to transport him, the 250, 300 miles to where he needs to be buried, and so in his case, it does work. It is doable, but it's still a big undertaking in their world. You couldn't just load them on a plane and fly them over. I mean, it was work. But I think in Jacob's case, there's something actually even bigger going on than just family attachment. If anything, I would have expected Jacob to say, you know what, I loved my wife Rachel so much. All my life I've more, everything's been about her, and I want to be buried with her when I die. That's not what he says. Because his wife Rachel was not buried in the family plot. They buried her where she died. That's the normal practice. She got buried where she died. Leah happened to be near the family plot when she died, so that's where they buried her. I suspect Jacob is actually wanting to be a part of God's bigger story. It reaches beyond just him, just beyond just his life. He wants to be buried with Abraham and Isaac because God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob also knows and believes God's promise that God will make them a nation. He's going to take all his descendants and he's going to make them a nation. And someday he's going to take them back to that promised land. And he doesn't want his body left behind in Egypt. He knows that day's coming, and so he wants to be buried in the land that God had promised. Because that's where his people are eventually going to wind up. Jacob's desire, I think, goes beyond his life, beyond God's plan just for him, and to God doing something through him. He wants to be a part of God's plan even after death. And I think this is a good lesson for us. Are we looking beyond ourselves? Beyond our life? Beyond our circumstances? Beyond our family? Even beyond my lifetime? Do I desire to be a part of God's greater plan? See, I promise you, God has a plan that's bigger and better than just your lifetime. God's got eternity running. He's got a plan that's bigger and better than just what's going on in your life today. He has a plan that goes beyond you, but in his grace, he has invited us to be a part of that plan. Guys, this is one of the exciting things about Jesus. We get to be a part of his kingdom. And it's an eternal kingdom. There's a lot of things in the world we can be a part of, and they're not all bad. There's good things in the world you can do. That's okay. But understand, everything in this world is passing away. In Christ, we are invited to be a part of that which is eternal. Through Christ, we can experience a destiny that's greater than our own lives, an enduring legacy that goes generations beyond us. There's a song, I think it's called Thank You, and it's about a person who gets to heaven, and he's being thanked by people that he didn't even know he had helped this person. He didn't even know he touched that person. How many of us, when we get to heaven, someday in eternity, will have people generations later be able to say, thank you because of what you did. Thank you for teaching that Bible study. Thank you for being that witness. You didn't know, but I eventually did respond. Thank you for supporting that missionary because they reached my tribe. See, I'm looking forward to getting to heaven. We can see what God's done. Not what we've done, what God's done through us, because it's bigger than just us. What will God do through your work, through your life, while you're here on earth? What arrangements will you make for that to continue even after life's over? How are you going to be a part of God's eternal plan? I think for every believer, that's a good question to consider. And the place to begin is by giving your life to Jesus. And maybe you've already done that. That's good. Keep following Jesus. Go with Jesus. I'm going to tell you, He'll lead you through life's troubles. But if you haven't done that, if you have never made that decision, say, yes, I choose to follow Jesus. That's where you begin to experience that destiny that goes beyond your life, where you get to become a part of an eternal kingdom and watch what God does through you.